Petroleum prices have risen sharply over the past few months, driving up the price of practically anything else you can think of, and once again raising the issue of Caribbean reliance on imported fossil fuel. Caribbean cities depend almost entirely on imported fuel to power homes and businesses and to transport goods and people. As a result, our economic health hangs in the balance of petroleum price fluctuations. The region's quest to lower carbon emissions is never-ending, but events such as the current fuel crisis tend to highlight the urgency of our need for energy security, placing a bit of extra force on the push towards cleaner energy and transportation. In the past, this additional drive might have faded once the fuel market started to stabilize, but things are perhaps more likely to keep pushing right along this time. Persistent public engagement over the years has greatly increased awareness of issues such as climate change, and ongoing research and investment have yielded massive improvements in technologies such as solar PV and electric vehicles, improving efficiency and accessibility in the process. We at CESA wanted to explore these developments further, so we did what we always do. We got in touch with the experts. First, we spoke to David Barrett, Principal Consultant at NBAR Consulting, who showed us how renewables are already integrating themselves into Caribbean economies.
You have the government itself procuring renewable systems and establishing bid processes for procurement.
Then we got in touch with Xavier Gordon, CEO of Flash Motors, who helped us take a closer look at electric vehicles and the regional market forming around them.
I think a very important part that we would like to continue working on, and we do have the product for, but obviously we need to work with agencies on that, is public transportation.
Finally, we sat down with Curtis Boodoo, Assistant Professor in the Utilities and Sustainable Engineering Unit at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. He highlighted some of the important regional implications of electrifying Caribbean transportation and broadened our scope on the potential for electric mobility to benefit Caribbean cities.
Perhaps we could investigate the use of an electric ferry for inter-island transport among our multi-island states.
So let's talk about energy security as we examine Caribbean adoption of renewable energy and clean transportation in this episode of CESA Voices. The volatility of the fuel market is on full display right now, emphasizing the clear energy security benefits of renewables.
Gas prices will again hit a new record high this week.
Some of us might imagine this as a temporary window of opportunity to be seized upon by solar companies and other actors within the renewable sector. But renewable energy consultant David Barrett knows the sector is far beyond the point of relying on such things.
So unfortunately, the Caribbean islands have had an unfortunate habit of getting very excited about renewables and putting a lot of energy and enthusiasm into it when there's a crisis, when the oil crisis was with us in the 70s and challenges in the 80s. And of course, now the prices, shot up over $100 per barrel. And so there's a lot of excitement. I think this time around, though, that we are having a ratcheting effect, if I can use that terminology. In other words, having come to this point where we have pushed more renewables, it's unlikely that the rate of acceleration will slow down.
David's been involved in numerous renewable development projects and has collaborated with stakeholders from different parts of the region. His work has shown him that there are multiple factors already driving the transition process.
There's now a lot of infrastructure investment, one, and a lot of these investments won't roll back. They're locked into tariff, they're locked into the grid, T&D. Two, the cry for lower electricity prices is right across the region. But what I've seen is that there's less of an emphasis on finding fossil options and more of a preference to finding renewable options, indigenous options, to lower that cost. Then there is a lot of support from the international multilateral agencies supporting the development of renewables and supporting the acceleration of the penetration of renewables. So I think at least those three things are going to cause us to ratchet upward the inclusion of renewables rather than pulling back once those prices start to fall. And of course, the oil prices have fallen since, $140 per barrel. They're coming back down, but I don't think that's going to affect the region in terms of its interest in renewable development, particularly electricity.
A region powered primarily by renewables isn't a matter of speculation anymore. The Caribbean is pretty much on a set course at this point, which amounts to a much safer bet for investors.
Renewables investments have now become even more secure. Again, they're locked into the tariffs, the T&D, so there's an ability to now do a long-term plan for your investment. For smaller systems, you have net billing and net metering. Net metering being a sort of one-to-one cost for selling your electricity as you buy. Net billing is some portion of what the utility would have spent for power generation. Usually it's tied to short-run costs associated with fuel. Here it is again, you can sort of plan around your investment returns. And residentials are finding that they can pay off the debt or the cost of the investment within 4 years. The utilities are finding that they can pay off that expense, within 8 to 10 years. So planning is now locked in. It's not a matter of not knowing when you'll get the returns on your investment.
The stakes have lowered significantly, especially in the case of solar PV.
What we're finding is that the prices for equipment is trending down. So, for example, the framework, the prices are coming down because they're now making them in modular fashions where it's a sort of click, screw, and install, as opposed to sort of drilling and welding things to put up your frames. The solar panels, properly called modules, are coming down in costs. A large amount of manufacturing is done, so volume is important, materials is important, things which were front-edge science, research kind of materials are now commonplace.
Solar PV has become particularly accessible over the years, right down to the availability of safe, affordable financing.
Let's not forget our commercial institutions. They are now offering solar loans, solar PV loans, left, right, and center. And a number of government institutions. So, for example, in Jamaica, we have the Development Bank of Jamaica, which is offering special interest rates, which go to primarily your approved financial institutions to lower those rates. So again, here's some security on that. And of course, let's not leave out our development partners. I know, for example, in Jamaica, you have USAID, which provided a loan guarantee. So they didn't actually provide a loan itself, but what they did was to guarantee that if there was a default on the renewable energy loan, there was some risk management for the financial institutions.
Renewables are steadily approaching mainstream status, with a rapidly expanding sales and service industry responding to their ever-increasing demand. And measures are being put in place to widen access to the many opportunities being generated in the process.
There are a number of training programs so that a company no longer is sort of flying by the seat of its pants or trying to install these systems purely on an engineering basis, as in you have to be a mechanical or electrical engineer only to be involved in the industry. You have training programs like the Certified Energy Managers Program. You have the North American-based Energy Professional, the NABCEP Inspector Certification Program. It also has an installation program. You have the Florida Solar Institute training and many others. In Jamaica, we have HEART that has a solar program that trains persons to physically install systems.
State support has played a major role in the sector's growth, although it certainly took some time and dialogue for governments in the region to get involved. In fairness, though, this wasn't necessarily a matter of Caribbean leaders failing to see the benefits offered by renewables.
So for many of the Caribbean islands, while we try to work through our international loans or IMF loans and others, the governments tended to be a little hesitant to do things like incentives, fiscal support, impacting duties and so on. But now many of them have cleared their loans. Right. So the states are now beginning to open up to giving incentives, which signals its confidence in the renewable energy sector. And then, of course, I mentioned state institutions like the DBJ, which gives special loans based on where they receive their finances from. And you have the government itself procuring renewable systems and establishing bid processes for procurement.
Having already been forced to grapple with the harsh impacts of climate change and the burdens of high fuel costs, often in combination, Caribbean governments aren't exactly opposed to the idea of clean renewable energy.
Right now in Jamaica, there's a study that's to be initiated, I believe, looking at the full breadth of solar PV that can be installed on every single roof in Jamaica. And I know that there are other studies like that throughout the region. So the government has sent a clear signal in policy, a clear signal in its financial interventions, fiscal or financial. And of course, let us, take our hats off to our international development partners, which have come on board to give support to the region.
Keep in mind, by the way, that all this support isn't limited to solar PV.
There's a lot of interest in hydro. Guyana has a significant hydro potential. Also, of course, wind. Wind is a big one. You have Wigton Wind Farm, 67 megawatts. You have Blue Mountain Renewables, and you have other interests within the region for adding wind. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados has a big plan for wind. If you want to look a little bit on the edge, you have islands like Barbados that have significant opportunities for wave energy. And there might be some islands with current. Let's not forget also geothermal. Geothermal is very big. I really should mention biomass, specifically waste to energy. Waste to energy is a significant opportunity, especially for smaller islands which have land constraints.
We're making great strides as it relates to renewable development, but these untapped sources serve as a reminder that there's always room for additional growth.
For us to really maximize our renewable energy potentials, we have to ensure that we have sufficient trained professionals within our region. Let's increase the capacity. And we can do that from the various trainings. I mentioned NABCEP, I mentioned the CEM program. I know that Barbados and others have training programs. Two, I think that there's a significant potential for electric vehicles, and we have to tie those electric vehicles at some point to clean energy. Otherwise, you have only really achieved a part of what you want to achieve with EVs. Then I think policy is, of course, going to be important because that points the direction for the investors and for your development partners and for the country to strive towards something. So I'd say policy is something else that also needs to change.
And speaking of things that need to change,
there has to be a way to begin to wean ourselves off our fossil fuel infrastructure. A lot of financial investment has been made in fossil fuel turbines and so on, power systems. But we have to be determined to schedule the retirement of these systems. And it may be easier for countries where the utility is not owned by the government. When the government is the owner of the utility, it presents a little bit more of a molasses effect. It's a slower transition, away from these expensive infrastructure, which consume a lot of fossil fuel.
As an active participant in the transition process, David knows there's still a lot of work yet to be done. But he's not at all concerned about our capacity to reach our energy goals based on what he sees around him.
The normal man on the street is more environmentally sensitive than maybe 2 decades ago or even a decade ago. we're talking climate change as a part of regular conversation. This is not, consultants within the government sector talking about climate change. This is the man on the street. It's the farmer who can't get his, the rain that he wants when he wants. This is the students who are complaining that it's too hot during the summer. It's a very common conversation. And then tied to that now is the conversation that says, hey, so how can we play our part in reducing the effects of climate change? And here's mitigation with, solar PV or wind or hydro or any of those other technologies. So we have a much more savvy population within the region on those things. We're getting so much more exposed to the technologies because we're seeing them more. We're having these, school trips to wind farms and to solar farms, and people are just following the buzz. It's an exciting time when our people have become more savvy, when our people are beginning to demand of our governments to make that shift towards cleaner, greener, indigenous sources. So we're in a good place.
I was born to be free.
Renewable energy holds the power to significantly loosen the shackles of the oil and gas industry, but it can't set our economies free on its own. In order to slide out of our fossil fuel restraints, the Caribbean must address the issue of transportation, which accounts for 30 to 60% of the energy used by CARICOM states. This presents lucrative opportunities for entrepreneurs like Xavier Gordon. After establishing a successful solar company in Ontario, Canada, and spreading into the province's emerging electric vehicle sector, Xavier and his business partners started looking into the foreign market, eventually setting their sights on Jamaica.
In 2018, we worked with JPS to evaluate their internal fleet of vehicles. Being a utility, they have a fleet of vehicles that they use to service and reach out into the communities that they service. So we looked at that fleet and we helped them evaluate where the opportunities to electrify would be. And in doing so, we were able to really understand where the benefits of electric mobility would be, and we quantified that. It was actually the first empirical study of electric vehicles in the Caribbean. We pulled actual data, and we put data loggers on the fleets of vehicles in JPS, and we were able to really understand that EVs would save on maintenance costs and energy. In looking at that, we understood that there was a very good opportunity from a business perspective for EVs to take off.
Xavier and his team went on to work with utilities, government agencies, and development banks in different parts of the region, gaining an understanding of the various local markets in the process.
The conclusion we came to was that there is a need for supply of EVs and a need for expertise around charging infrastructure. And so that gave birth to our new company, which is the Flash Motors Company, which we launched earlier this year in Jamaica. It's a regional company. So Jamaica is one of our first markets, but it's not our only market. We also do work in Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia, Bahamas, Bermuda, Belize, and Guyana as well. So taking all the experience over the years that we've done here, both in Canada as well across the region, we looked and identified where the opportunity would be and where the gap is in the market. There really isn't an assured expertise behind electric vehicles and electric mobility. On the supply side and on the infrastructure side. So that's the gap that we fill, and that's the gap that we think is going to be important to really unlock in the market.
Electric mobility could save the region billions of dollars each year on fuel imports alone, while significantly lowering carbon emissions, even though these benefits do come at a high initial cost. For now.
Currently, you're looking at anywhere between a 10 to 15% premium on the purchase price of the vehicles. But that's coming down quite a bit from as high as 50%, as little as 2 to 3 years ago. What we're faced with essentially is a declining gap between the capital costs between electric vehicles. And that just has to do with economies of scale. Tens of millions of internal combustion engine vehicles are built every year. EVs are, cracking past 2 million now. And so the supply chain is starting to get there. So the globally accepted standard for price equality is 2025. In some markets and some sectors, price equality has already been reached. For instance, in China, a diesel bus and an electric bus cost exactly the same. So it's simply, just like we saw with solar, where, 10 years ago, solar energy was extremely expensive. It was the most expensive form of energy, fast forward to 2022, and solar energy and wind are cheaper than coal and gas.
EVs may very well cost less than ICE vehicles someday, but the energy efficiency factor alone makes them quite competitive in today's market.
Energy costs are significantly less. It obviously does depend on the energy costs in each individual market, but because an electric motor is 90 to 95% efficient versus an internal combustion engine, which is somewhere between 15 to 25% efficient, you're always going to be more energy efficient in running an electric vehicle than you would an internal combustion engine vehicle. Now, if we look at, let's say, different markets here in Canada where electricity is relatively cheap, the difference between fueling up a gasoline or diesel car and charging an electric car is about 8 to 10 times more efficient or more affordable, I should say, for an EV. In a place like Jamaica, where fuel costs are relatively high, but electricity is extremely high, that ratio, instead of being 10 to 1, is more around a 4 to 1 ratio. But still, 4 to 1 is an excellent ratio when it comes to fueling.
The energy efficiency benefits are fairly obvious. But one important benefit of EVs that's often overlooked is their low maintenance cost.
Less components, less moving parts, no transmission, no emission system to deal with, no oil or belts or time belts, etc. You remove a lot of components that add a lot of wear and tear and require a lot of maintenance from the vehicle. You're essentially left with an electric motor and an inverter and a battery system. The battery system is not really designed for any sort of maintenance. There's no maintenance to be done to the battery. An electric motor is, one of the modern marvels of engineering. Electric motors will typically outlast the vehicle body itself. They don't need any sort of, work like an internal combustion engine vehicle may need after, a few 100,000 kilometers. And, it's a one-speed transmission system. So you don't have as many gears and belts to deal with.
Of course, some maintenance and repair will be required from time to time, but that's a fairly straightforward affair, assuming you purchase your vehicle from a licensed dealer such as Flash Motors, with trained technicians and manufacturer support. But we know that's not always the case here in the Caribbean.
My concern is that as people get excited about EVs, and rightfully so, they may start just, reaching out into the foreign markets and bringing in unsupported vehicles, which won't necessarily have the parts or the necessary training for people to be able to service and work on them. So I think it's going to be really important that the government continues to invest, and the government has been working with the Inter-American Development Bank and providing generic training for stakeholders. I know the JAGAS, which is the leading automotive school in Jamaica. They've undertaken training programs. I believe they're doing some more later on this month, in the month of May, through an Inter-American Development Bank project. And then it's going to be, continued investment by the Ministry of Education and through any of the other government agencies to ensure that third-party shops and third-party servicemen are able to acquire those skills to be able to work with those gray market vehicles and any other sort of used vehicles that come into the marketplace. So, it's two prongs to it. I think the established dealers will work with their manufacturers to ensure that they have parts and training on it. And, like I said, there are programs that are happening right now through the IDB, through the Caribbean Development Bank as well, too, through the JPS Foundation as well, to ensure that those third-party and used car service providers are able to catch up on the training as well.
On the topic of training, there's also the issue of emergency services. EVs actually tend to have higher safety ratings than ICE vehicles, but accidents do happen. Are emergency responders prepared?
What we do, with our Flash Motors vehicles is, as these vehicles get deployed, we do provide sort of training notes out to emergency responders so that they can understand where those disconnects are for high voltage vehicles. For our high voltage vehicles, there are also training programs that are going on with the Caribbean Development Bank and Inter-American Development Bank to provide generic training. I've also seen other private dealers look at doing that as well, too. So the necessary stakeholders from a public safety point of view are being kept informed and are being sort of brought along with the process. Obviously, we're still early stages. I don't believe there's a generic blanketed process for everybody, but I think all the stakeholders and all the actors in the market are ensuring that as they bring their product into the market, that they're providing those responders with information to be able to do the disconnect of the system. And it's typically, a place in the car where you simply pull a switch and that disconnects the high voltage line, which then allows them to, give access to the vehicle if they need to do any sort of crimping or tearing in order to access anything in the vehicle.
Another concern involves the availability of public charging. But this is already being addressed in emerging markets, such as Jamaica.
The private and the utility sector have been very responsive and have ensured that the necessary investments are being made so that no matter where you go in Jamaica, even if you do have your own private charging station at home or at work, you can rest assured to know that you will still have access elsewhere. And it's an important thing for the psyche. Internal combustion engine vehicle drivers, you're used to seeing gas stations everywhere, so you feel confident knowing you can drive anywhere. And that sort of confidence is needed to encourage adoption. So it's infrastructure, it's important infrastructure, but it's also marketing.
It's also a matter of accessibility.
Not everybody will have access to private charging at home. If you're a renter or you're leasing or you're in an older condominium or apartment that may not necessarily have space for infrastructure for a private charging station, or you're in a shared private charging station. Maybe your workplace doesn't have the ability to put in charging station. Not everybody will be able to put in their own charger based on the nature of how they live. And so therefore public charging will be the only way for them to do that. So having access to public charging is a necessary good. It's a public good. And in addition, you still want to have flexibility to be able to top up.
Xavier and his partners are focused on the full spectrum of offerings, from commercial vehicles for businesses to retail products aimed at individuals and families. But their ultimate goal is to extend the benefits of electrification to everyone.
I think a very important part that we would like to continue working on, and we do have the product for, but obviously we need to work with agencies on that, is public transportation. That's where you are able to impact people the most. Buses, shuttles, minivans, coaster vans, all of those are really big opportunities that we're very eager to tap into, because that's where everybody gets to benefit from electric mobility. We don't want electric mobility to be gate kept just for businesses or persons who are able to afford private transportation, because that's in the minority. In pretty much most markets we're in, the majority of persons that in Jamaica use public transportation one way or another, whether it's a taxi or a bus, and we want to be able to unlock the benefits of that for them as well. And so, we're eager to continue to work with government agencies, public transit, private taxi companies, tourism-based companies, to ensure that they can figure out the best way to unlock electric mobility. And I think that's where our true metric of success is going to be.
Many great minds in the region are focused on these kinds of issues. There's a lot of work being done by researchers such as Curtis Boodoo, who understand the need to maximize e-mobility's impact within the Caribbean, firstly by addressing barriers of access. For instance, EVs with their high energy efficiency and low maintenance costs could significantly boost economies in the region by drastically reducing operating expenditure for businesses. But for this to happen, the majority of these businesses need to actually be able to make use of EVs, which brings us back to one particular issue.
So if you're looking at all classes of electric vehicles, passenger cars, fleet electric vehicles, scooters for delivery, they cost more, or they have that higher upfront cost compared to their internal combustion engine counterpart, or their ICE technology counterpart. And that initial hurdle is very difficult to overcome by businesses, and especially small businesses with limited access to financing. And this is something that the region and governments within the region needs to look at. If we are to support entrepreneurship, if we are to support small businesses, if we are to support our service sector.
According to the Caribbean Development Bank, 70 to 85% of Caribbean businesses are micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, which contribute between 60 and 70% of gross domestic product and account for roughly 50% of total employment in the region. Many of these businesses offer services that are crucial to driving economic activity, and yet they're often the ones cut off from technologies that could boost their effectiveness in that regard.
Governments in the region have addressed this situation. Barbados would have reduced the taxation on electric vehicles further. They have not zero-rated it, but they would have reduced it. Trinidad would have zero-rated taxes and duties on electric vehicles in January of this year. Guyana has zero rating on electric vehicles for quite some time now. Antigua and Barbuda has zero rating on EVs. Montserrat has an excellent policy on electric vehicles. So member states within CARICOM have already recognized the importance of EVs.
Of course, governments in the region are already dealing with economic challenges, even without considering those brought on by the pandemic.
It's something that would have to be looked at most definitely individually amongst member states. And it is something that they would have to look at and take into consideration their climate change commitments, whatever economic growth that could come out of electric vehicles. They have to look at maintaining a national budget, because we would see throughout the region, member states are rolling out or spending more on social programs to support the difficult times under the pandemic and even the low economic activity coming out of the pandemic. So quite a lot of public funds are going towards social programs. So if you're redirecting funds towards social programs to support the pandemic, it's very a difficult balancing act now to reduce your revenue from taxation of vehicles when you are already committing otherwise to help the pandemic. So it's a very difficult balancing act.
What about the commercial banks? Is there a role for them here as well, where, through financing solutions?
To help with the adoption of EVs, at least at the passenger sedan sector, commercial banks should look at restructuring their requirements as it relates to vehicle loans. And what do I mean by that? I mean that an electric vehicle does cost more than a comparative ICE vehicle. And when you visit the bank and you want to seek financing, the bank will make a determination on your income and your responsibilities and come up with a sum that would be of a low risk for them to lend you. But if electric vehicles are more expensive than ICE vehicles, then quite a number of persons may not qualify for a sum that will allow you to own an electric vehicle. But I believe commercial banks should consider that the overall cost of ownership of an electric vehicle is less than an ICE vehicle. You would pay less for fuel, you would pay less for maintenance. That overall cost that they would have to give up from their budget monthly would be less. So this is something that perhaps the commercial banks should look at.
The combination of accessible financing options and government incentives could certainly do a lot to drive up overall adoption rates. But only amongst those able to afford vehicles in the first place, who, as our previous guest pointed out, make up the minority of Caribbean markets. This is why Curtis also believes we should move quickly to electrify public transportation.
Our commuting public throughout the region stand and wait for transportation twice a day, early in the morning and perhaps after 4 when they leave. The particulate emissions that you would find on the side of the road, that exposure daily is very high because we live in a very dense urban setting. We work in a very dense urban setting. So to benefit the commuting public, to benefit the working class, to benefit children getting to school, we have to, in our first rollout of electric vehicles, in my opinion, focus on public transportation and fleets. You focus on fleets for businesses, so you support businesses, and of course, they would support that local economic activity. And by you focusing on public transportation, you get to reach the more vulnerable in society.
In Curtis's view, this needs to be part of an overall effort to streamline public transportation systems in the region.
If you have a quick read of the publicly available Auditor General reports on the state-owned public transportation institutions in your region, you would be surprised at the inefficiencies. This is not singling out a single member state. This is quite a number of member states do have long-standing issues with state-owned or partially state-owned public transportation. And because our public transportation is inefficient, we have more cars than we need to go to work and leave. Because we are not confident in our public transportation, we are not confident of the reliability and security. So we find other inefficient means which involves the more use of cars in our urban setting. And you could pick any national from any CARICOM country, and they will complain to you about the traffic in their capital city or whatever urban center they have to visit for goods and services. So we move towards electrifying public transportation, in addition to focusing resources towards improving the reliability and safety of our public transportation.
Electrifying public transportation might be an effective way for governments to cut down on spending, while also taking the lead on e-mobility. And this could extend to other areas of the public sector.
So the maintenance cost for public sector vehicles is high. Of course, again, the fuel costs will be even higher, especially now. So it really does lend itself to electrification in the public sector. And it helps towards the overall deployment of electric vehicles. Once the state takes this initial risk in what is by some maybe deemed a new technology, then that exposure to the technology will filter down to the everyday citizen, and whatever doubts they have about the technology would hopefully subside. So I think that we should also look at our largest public sector fleet users, of course, public transportation and buses being number one.
Of course, this isn't the only way for Caribbean governments to chart the way forward.
There needs to be focus towards the development of transportation policies in the region. Member states need to develop transportation policies, and I think we have moved beyond transportation policies, and we should develop sustainable transportation policies. At the regional level, at the CARICOM level, there should be a regional sustainable transportation policy, just like we have at the CARICOM level, a sustainable energy policy and an energy policy within CARICOM that does have targets for renewable energy deployment. So we need that similar policy framework at both the regional and national levels for member states to address transportation.
Policies that are clear, data-driven, and properly targeted can make all the difference when tackling issues like the ones we've discussed in this episode so far. Here's a good example.
Guyana has a very interesting electric vehicle taxation policy, in that if you import a new electric vehicle, you incur taxes. But if you import a used electric vehicle, you do not incur taxes. Now, this policy directly addresses the inequality as it relates to electric vehicles, because what you're doing is that you are providing the tax exemptions for persons who could only afford a used vehicle, or a used electric vehicle in this case. But what that means in Guyana is that there's quite a number of used vehicles, there's quite a number of batteries that are coming into the country that are used. So there is a great opportunity to take these batteries when they have capacity that is not really feasible to use for transport, and use them for renewable energy. There are quite a number of communities in Guyana that are without a great connection, mainly because of the vast size of the country. So the use of solar and batteries is a focus currently of the government in Guyana and of many past governments, and will be a focus in the future. So you have this opportunity to keep the life of this battery from this electric vehicle that you brought into the country to reduce emissions in transportation sector, to now at the end of its life continue to reduce emissions in the power or the electricity sector.
This is exactly the kind of broad-minded approach needed to figure out how to get the most out of electric mobility, especially within the context of the diverse island geographies found here in the Caribbean region.
We in CARICOM, quite a number of member states in CARICOM, are blessed to be multi-island states. Of course, we have the main island where most of the inhabitants live, with most of the economic activity, with most of the services and products. But you, of course, do have the smaller islands. Persons live there, their economic activity, there's tourism. And the distance between the main island and these smaller satellite islands, if you allow me to call it that, can be relatively small. And there are electric boats that are in the market today that can satisfy the range of travel between certain multi-island states. And of course, now you begin to clean up emissions in the maritime sector. So electric boats can be looked at as it relates to tourism and as it relates to our existing economic activities along our rivers. And perhaps we could investigate the use of an electric ferry for inter-island transport among our multi-island states.
Given the right approach, even technologies less suited to solving today's problems might become solutions tomorrow.
There has been a lot of talk regarding hydrogen and transportation globally. Using hydrogen for transportation within the CARICOM perspective, I don't see as being feasible in the medium and long term. I believe electric vehicles are the solution. And there are many technical reasons for that. If you look at the entire value chain in terms of energy losses from the production of renewable energy all the way to the use of that energy in an electric vehicle, you save energy compared to the equivalent hydrogen production that would lead to power in a vehicle. But hydrogen can be used for transport in the region. And I want to bring back this old technology to the region of zeppelins or airships.
Now, for some of our listeners, the word Zeppelin might conjure up images of the well-known Hindenburg accident in 1937. But the Zeppelin company actually had a spotless safety record spanning 27 years prior to that event. Airships were widely considered to be the most reliable mode of overseas transport at the time, and the Hindenburg itself made 62 successful flights across the Atlantic before its untimely demise, often carrying other aircraft.
Of course, the Hindenburg did pass through South America, Trinidad, and CARICOM countries in the past. So the region is not strange to have airships, or in this case, a Zeppelin. But with the predominance of hydrogen and advancement in technologies and material sciences, I could see hydrogen airships returning to the region. And let me tell you why. A flight from a CARICOM country to another CARICOM country may take an hour, all right? Unless it's Trinidad to Jamaica, it'll take more. But other member states, it's typically an hour. If you use a hydrogen airship or a Zeppelin, that time will increase to perhaps 1.5 to 2 hours, which is still manageable. It isn't too long. But what airships bring is the ability to bring more cargo and heavier cargo and transport heavier cargo. And this could potentially decrease the cost for shipping goods within CARICOM member states. And it will be faster than ships. But of course, it'll be slower than an airplane. What it also does, it reduces emissions in air transport drastically. And it allows the transportation of valuable goods post-disaster. So within the CARICOM context and the interconnection of the islands, we could look at Zeppelins, airships that are hydrogen-powered, being used regularly to move goods and perhaps people.
As we're being forcefully reminded right now, energy insecurity is a major concern for Caribbean countries, which must already contend with environmental hazards and economic constraints. Transitioning towards more sustainable energy sources and transportation methods can help solve all these problems, and we're starting to make serious progress thanks to the hard work of regional stakeholders and the support of governments, commercial institutions, and multilateral agencies. We've actually come quite a long way, and we can take things even further by developing effective policies aimed at smoothing the transition process and impacting as many people as possible. Anyway, that's all we have for you on this episode of Caesar Voices. We'd like to thank our guests for taking the time to share their insights with us. We'd also like to thank our funded partner, the Barbados Environment Conservation Trust, for making this episode possible. The Trust aims to help Barbados reach its national development goals by supporting local initiatives aimed at environmental sustainability. Of course, we'd also like to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you like what you've been hearing so far, please feel free to give us a rating wherever you're listening. We'd also like to remind you that you can visit our website, caesarjournal.org/donations, to lend your financial support, or join our monthly donor club on Patreon and gain access to exclusive content, or even be featured in an episode of our podcast. Just click the links in the description. And if you'd like to sponsor an episode of Caesar Voices and feature your company or NGO, please click on our corporate link to learn more.